2:07 a.m., June 14, 2026. Fredericksburg, Virginia. 34 ATF vehicles moved along Route 3 with their headlights off. No radio chatter, no brake lights. The convoy held 60-foot spacing at 35 miles per hour for the final 2 miles, using the darkness and the tree line to stay out of sight of the facility's exterior cameras. Cameras that had been documented in aerial passes and mapped against the property's sight lines. Behind them, 12 FBI units held position at the tree line. The target, a commercial paintball and tactical training complex set back from the highway on 11 acres of cleared Virginia woodland. Estimated contraband inside, 400 illegal suppressors. Estimated black market value, $2, $3 million. From the road, the facility looked like any other weekend warrior operation. Spray-painted bunkers, inflatable barriers, a gravel lot with pickup trucks and SUVs. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, Tactical EDGE Training and Recreation, PRIVATE Event Tunnet. The private event had 47 attendees. 12 of them were about to be detained. 4 of those 12 were active duty U.S. military personnel. The operation had a name. The agents who built it had been working it for 9 months. And it had started not with a tip, not with a criminal complaint, not with a confidential informant walking into a field office. It had started with a radio signal that nobody was supposed to hear. In the spring of 2026, a Pentagon UAP investigation team operating near Virginia's Atlantic coast picked up encrypted radio traffic on a frequency they weren't expecting. The team was there for something else entirely. The intercept was brief, fragmented, and outside their jurisdiction. But the content was specific enough to flag. The signal referenced a quantity, a transaction, a location. The UAP team passed the intercept to Naval Criminal Investigative Service within 72 hours. NCIS passed it to ATF within 48 hours after that. By the time it reached ATF's Firearms Trafficking Division in Washington, D.C., it had been cross-referenced against a secondary source, a pattern of anomalous ATF trace requests that Pentagon analysts had been quietly flagging for months. That pattern pointed to a single Virginia zip code, and to a business that, on paper, had no reason to appear in a federal weapons trace at all. The facility was called Tactical Edge Training and Recreation. It had operated since 2020 with a valid commercial license, a clean business registration, and no prior law enforcement contact. Its owner was Garrett Mallory, retired U.S. Navy ordnance technician, 16 years of service, top secret clearance maintained until June 2023. On the surface, Mallory ran a legitimate operation. Paintball rentals, corporate team-building events, tactical training weekends for civilians who wanted a military-style experience without enlisting. The kind of business that does well in the exurbs of Northern Virginia, where the population skews toward former military, defense contractors, and people with concealed carry permits. The kind of business nobody looks at twice. What struck me, going through the early case materials, was how clean the paper trail was. 6 years of operation. Not a single complaint. Not a single inspection flag. Mallory had built something that was genuinely hard to see unless you were already looking. And even then, you needed the right angle. The right angle, in this case, was a weight discrepancy in a suppressor component trace request that should have been routine. ATF's Firearms Trace Center processes hundreds of thousands of trace requests every year. Most are straightforward. A weapon recovered at a crime scene, a serial number run against the federal database, a paper trail back to the original point of sale. Legal firearms have documented histories. They move through channels. They leave records. Suppressors, legally manufactured and transferred under the National Firearms Act, leave records too. Registration, tax stamp, transfer of documentation. Each step is logged. What doesn't leave a clean record is a suppressor component that passes individual inspection because it's classified as a legal parts kit, but assembles into a functioning suppressor with the addition of a single machined sleeve. That sleeve was what the Pentagon analysts had flagged. Beginning in late October 2025, trace requests involving recovered suppressors in 3 separate federal investigations had returned a common thread: internal component geometry that matched a specific machining signature. The dimensions were unusual. Not impossible for a commercial manufacturer, but unusual. The tolerances were tighter than standard. The finish was consistent across samples from different states. One set of components had appeared in a Chicago gang weapons case, another in a Florida organized crime seizure, a third in a Houston federal prosecution. 3 different jurisdictions, 3 different investigations, same machining signature. The Pentagon analyst who first noticed the pattern was not an ATF employee. She was a defense acquisition specialist reviewing component data for an unrelated audit. She flagged the anomaly in an internal report marked routine. The report sat for 3 weeks before a cross-agency data sharing protocol, implemented in early 2025 as part of a federal weapons trafficking initiative, automatically forwarded it to ATF's trafficking division. By the time a human analyst at ATF reviewed the flag, the facility in Virginia had already conducted 4 more private training events. Mallory had served as a Navy explosive ordnance disposal technician for 16 years. His specialty was improvised explosive device defeat, identifying and neutralizing field-assembled weapons built from legal components. He understood, better than most, how legal parts could be combined into illegal devices. He understood the tolerances, the geometry, the inspection criteria that defined the legal boundary between a parts kit and a suppressor. He had trained alongside Marine Force reconnaissance units in Fallujah and Ramadi, cataloging field-assembled IEDs constructed from hardware store components. That experience gave him a detailed understanding of how inspection thresholds worked and where they stopped working. He had learned the gray zone from the inside. At some point, the precise timeline is still being reconstructed. Mallory applied that knowledge in reverse. Instead of defeating improvised weapons, he had started manufacturing them. The machining shop he built in the rear building of Tactical Edge was fully equipped: a CNC lathe, a vertical milling machine, precision measuring equipment. Not a hobbyist operation, a production facility. Here's what made this case stand out to investigators. It wasn't the volume of suppressors produced. It was the distribution model. Most illegal suppressor operations sell locally, through personal networks, at gun shows, through social media. Mallory wasn't doing that. His buyers were spread across at least 11 states. And they weren't random buyers. They were connected to existing federal cases. That detail, suppressors from a single Virginia facility appearing in active federal investigations in multiple jurisdictions, is what pushed this from an ATF trace anomaly to an FBI priority. The FBI's Domestic Terrorism and Weapons Unit opened a parallel inquiry in May 2026, 3 weeks after ATF received the radio intercept. The 2 agencies ran independent investigations for 11 days before a joint task force meeting in Arlington consolidated their findings. What they had at that point, a machining facility hidden inside a legitimate business, a distribution network spanning more than a dozen states. A former Navy technician with the skills to manufacture components that exploited the legal gray zone between parts kits and functional suppressors, and an intercept suggesting active transaction coordination in the weeks before the June 14th raid. What they didn't have yet, confirmation that the machining shop still existed, confirmation that Mallory was still operating, and confirmation that the 47 attendees at the private tactical weekend knew anything about what was in the back building. Those confirmations would take 9 more weeks. The investigation that followed was methodical in a way that felt almost slow given what was at stake. But the lead agents on both sides had built weapons cases before, and they understood the risk of moving too fast. A premature approach, a surveillance unit spotted near the property, a subpoena that tipped off a peripheral buyer, could collapse the entire network before the full scope was documented. The question that kept coming back in the case files was this: how had Mallory identified buyers connected to active federal investigations? The suppressors showing up in Chicago and Houston and Florida weren't accidents. Someone with those buyers' contact information had to be directing them toward Mallory's facility. That intermediary, if one existed, had not yet been identified. And here's the part that still doesn't sit right. The suppressor components recovered in the Chicago case had serial numbers etched onto them. Mallory's machining signature, but serial numbers. Not required by law for unregistered suppressors. Their presence was an anomaly. Some investigators interpreted it as Mallory creating a false paper trail. Others thought it reflected a customer request. The serial numbers were never fully explained at the indictment stage. 3 weeks into the parallel FBI inquiry, a confidential source, identified in court documents only as CS7, provided a statement confirming that Mallory had briefed at least 2 clients during private training events on what he called the gray zone. The briefings were described as informal, Mallory explaining, in technical terms, why individual components were legal, why assembly into a functional device was not, and why the distinction created an opportunity for buyers willing to accept that ambiguity. CS7's initial contact with federal agents had not been a walk-in. According to materials filed under seal, investigators had identified CS7 through a peripheral connection to the Florida organized crime case, one of the 3 jurisdictions where the machining signature had appeared. The source was approached, agreed to cooperate, and provided 2 recorded statements over a 10-day period in late April 2026. Neither statement named Mallory directly by surname. Both described the gray zone briefings in enough technical detail that ATF examiners confirmed the account was consistent with the component geometry they had documented. CS7's account was corroborated by electronic surveillance authorized under a federal warrant. In May 2026, a court-approved wire intercept captured Mallory on a call with an unidentified party discussing component specifications and shipping logistics. The call lasted 6 minutes. The content was sufficient to support a warrant application. At that point, ATF and FBI had enough for an arrest. The tactical question was whether to move immediately or extend the investigation to identify the broader buyer network. The decision, made jointly by ATF's Washington Field Division Chief and the FBI's Weapons Unit Supervisor, was to wait for the June tactical weekend. The event was already scheduled. It was expected to draw attendees from outside Virginia. It offered an opportunity to document buyers in person, gather identifications, and potentially identify the intermediary connecting Mallory to buyers in other jurisdictions. The decision carried risk. 9 months of investigation had documented the facility and the manufacturing operation. But Mallory had not been under continuous physical surveillance. There was no guarantee he wouldn't move the machining equipment before June 14th. No guarantee the attendees would include anyone connected to active federal cases. There was an additional complication that nearly ended the investigation 3 weeks before the raid. On May 28, 2026, the electronic surveillance equipment near the property experienced a technical failure. The monitoring unit, placed on a utility easement adjacent to the property, lost power after a transformer issue on the county grid. The equipment was offline for 31 hours. During that window, ATF had no electronic coverage of the facility. When the monitoring unit came back online on May 30th, the first transmission captured was a call between Mallory and a party in another state. The content was technical and brief. But the gap, 31 hours with no coverage, meant there was a period with no record of what happened at Tactical Edge. The agents running the surveillance couldn't know whether Mallory had moved equipment, conducted a transaction, or made contact with buyers during that gap. What they knew was that the June 14th event was still on schedule. And based on pre-event electronic traffic, attendance was going to be higher than any previous tactical weekend. Put yourself in the lead agent's position. 9 months of investigation, a 31-hour gap in surveillance you can't explain. An event 10 days away that might be your best and last opportunity to document the full scope of the network. The pressure to move early was real. The pressure to wait was also real. The decision to hold was not easy. They held. Preparation for the June 14th operation ran through the first 2 weeks of June. 34 ATF agents were assigned to the entry team. 12 FBI agents were designated for secondary containment and evidence documentation. Virginia State Police provided perimeter support. The plan called for simultaneous entries at 2 points, the main facility entrance and a secondary access road on the eastern side of the property. The back building, where the machining shop was believed to be, was the primary evidence target. Entry to that structure required a separate warrant, obtained on June 12th. The warrant application described, in precise terms, what agents expected to find: a CNC lathe, a vertical milling machine, finished suppressor components, raw materials, and documentation of transactions. It also disclosed the machining signature evidence, the electronic surveillance, and the CS7 account. On June 13th, 24 hours before the raid, the tactical team held a final coordination briefing at a federal facility in Quantico. Building layouts were reviewed, entry points were assigned, evidence collection procedures were confirmed, radio frequencies were set. One detail changed in the final briefing that hadn't been anticipated. The building plans for the rear structure, obtained from county records, were dated 2019. Mallory had purchased the property in 2020. The plans showed the rear building as a storage structure with one access point. Physical surveillance in early June had captured imagery suggesting the building had been modified. A secondary access point, possibly a roll-up door on the north side, was visible in aerial imagery that hadn't appeared in the 2019 plans. The entry team adjusted. A 4-agent element was assigned to the north side of the rear building as a contingency. The adjustment took 11 minutes to coordinate. It would turn out to matter. 2:07 a.m., June 14th, 2026. The convoy moved. Headlights off. The lead ATF vehicles turned off Route 3 onto the access road at 2:09 a.m. By 2:11 a.m., the perimeter was established. State police units blocked both exit routes. FBI containment elements were in position at the tree line on the north and east sides. At 2:13 a.m., the entry team breached the main gate. 2 vehicles staged at the gate while the remaining units continued to the main structure. An ATF tactical unit peeled off to cover the eastern access road. The 47 attendees of the private tactical weekend were inside the main facility building, a converted warehouse that served as the staging area for paintball events. Some were asleep on cots along the west wall. Some were breaking down equipment from the day's activities, stacking protective gear near the entrance. According to the post-operation report, the first agents through the main door encountered no resistance. The attendees were instructed to remain seated and comply with federal officers. Compliance was immediate. Entry to the rear building happened simultaneously. The 4-agent contingency element assigned to the north side found the roll-up door from the aerial imagery. It was unlocked. The main entry team breached the south access point at 2:14 a.m. The north element made entry at 2:15 a.m. Inside, a fully operational machining shop, a CNC lathe, a vertical milling machine, metal shavings on the floor consistent with recent use, the kind of residue that accumulates over hours, not days. A workbench with suppressor components in various stages of completion, a storage rack with finished units, individually wrapped in brown wax paper and labeled with adhesive tags. The label system used a numerical code. Investigators working the scene that night counted 411 labeled packages. 411. At 2:19 a.m., the ATF evidence team leader transmitted the initial count to the Operations Command Post. The command post relayed it to the ATF Washington Field Division. The Field Division transmitted it to the Joint Task Force Coordinator at FBI Washington. 411 suppressor units distributed or ready for distribution at a single facility in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The machining shop also contained what appeared to be a client documentation system. A laptop computer and 2 external hard drives were seized as evidence. A printed binder, recovered from a locked cabinet that required a second warrant, obtained telephonically during the operation, contained what appeared to be transaction records. Dates, quantities, coded identifiers that investigators would spend weeks cross-referencing against existing federal cases. Mallory was located in the main facility building. He was among the first attendees identified and separated from the group. He did not resist. He made no statements at the scene. He invoked his right to counsel at 2:22 a.m. Among the 47 attendees detained and processed that night, 12 were held for extended questioning. 4 of those 12 were identified through military identification presented at the scene as active duty U.S. military personnel, 2 Army, 1 Air Force, 1 Navy. Their presence at a private tactical event run by a former Navy technician was not, by itself, evidence of criminal involvement. Each of the 4 was released pending further investigation. Their names were forwarded to military legal authorities. The other 8 held for extended questioning were released over the following 12 hours as ATF and FBI worked through initial interviews. 2 were later named as subjects of the ongoing investigation. Neither has been charged at this writing. Processing of the rear building took until approximately 6:30 a.m. By the time the sun came up over the Virginia woodland, the machining shop had been photographed, documented, and cleared. Agents worked systematically through each workstation, bagging and tagging components, photographing positions before anything was moved. Every surface was swabbed. The CNC lathe's internal memory was imaged on-site before the machine was tagged for seizure. The physical evidence was en route to ATF's evidence facility by 7:15 a.m. What's most striking, looking at this case from the outside, is the operational discipline the network had maintained for what appears to be at least 18 months. 411 units, buyers in 11 states, a manufacturing operation hidden inside a legitimate business, no prior law enforcement contact. The level of operational security, the parts kit model, the distributed sales approach, the legal business as cover, reflected exactly the kind of institutional knowledge Mallory had accumulated during 16 years of Navy ordnance work. The system failed him in the end, not because of anything he did wrong operationally. It failed because of an intercept that wasn't meant for ATF. A Pentagon team looking for something else entirely had picked up a signal that, under ordinary circumstances, would have passed unnoticed. Here's the take that may get some pushback. The legal gray zone Mallory exploited isn't unique to him. The parts kit model. Individual components legal to possess, assembly into a functional suppressor illegal without registration, has been documented in multiple prior federal cases. Each time, prosecution requires proving intent to assemble rather than simple possession. The current federal statutory framework creates an inspection bottleneck that investigators and prosecutors have described in court filings and public statements as insufficient for modern manufacturing capabilities. Mallory didn't invent the gray zone. He applied technical knowledge to an existing gap. The gap still exists. Garrett Mallory was charged on June 15, 2026, with manufacturing and distributing illegal suppressors in violation of the National Firearms Act, conspiracy to distribute unregistered NFA devices, and related federal weapons charges. He was held without bail pending trial. The federal indictment, filed in the Eastern District of Virginia, identified 411 suppressors recovered from the facility and alleged distribution of an unspecified number of additional units prior to the raid. Total production volume, according to the indictment, was estimated at more than 600 units over approximately 18 months of operation. The buyer network documented in the transaction records recovered from the rear building was not fully disclosed in the indictment. Prosecutors indicated in a sealed filing that the investigation into buyer identities and connections to existing federal cases was ongoing. As of late June 2026, 2 individuals identified in the transaction records had been contacted by federal agents. Neither had been charged. The investigation into buyers connected to the Chicago, Florida, and Houston cases, the 3 jurisdictions where the machining signature had originally been flagged, remained active. The intermediary who had connected Mallory to buyers in those jurisdictions, the person or channel that had directed buyers with active federal exposure toward a Virginia facility, had not been publicly identified. The electronic surveillance gap on May 28th and 29th, 31 hours when the monitoring equipment was offline, remained unexplained in the public record. What happened at Tactical Edge during that window is not documented in any filing that has been publicly released. The 4 active duty military personnel detained on the night of June 14th had not been publicly identified or charged as of the time of this account. Their involvement, if any, beyond attendance at a private training event was under review by military legal authorities. The rear building's machining shop, the production facility that had operated for at least 18 months inside a commercial paintball complex, was seized as evidence and is scheduled for civil forfeiture proceedings. The main facility remains closed. The business license for Tactical Edge Training and Recreation was suspended by Virginia authorities on June 16, 2026. Something about this case doesn't sit right, even now. Not the technical ingenuity, not the use of a legitimate business as cover. What's unresolved, and will probably stay unresolved for some time, is how much Mallory's clients actually knew. The gray zone briefings that CS7 described were, by that account, explicit. Mallory told clients what they were buying and why it was technically legal and legally ambiguous. Some clients understood that. Some may have understood it better than others. The suppressor units that ended up in Chicago, in Florida, in Houston, they ended up there because someone made a decision to use them. That chain of decisions, from machining shop to crime scene, runs through more than 11 states and more than a dozen buyers, most of whom have not been publicly identified. Here's a question worth putting to the comments. Should buyers who received a technical legal briefing before purchasing, who were told explicitly about the gray zone, bear criminal responsibility for what they did with those components? Or does culpability rest entirely with the manufacturer? The law has a clear answer. Whether that answer is the right one is a different question. The network that federal agents described in the Tactical Edge indictment is legally dismantled. The production facility is secured. The operator is in custody. The transaction records are in federal hands. The buyers are not all in custody. The components that left Tactical Edge before June 14th, the units from the estimated 600-plus total production run that weren't on the rack when ATF made entry, are not all accounted for. And the intermediary, the channel through which buyers in active federal cases found their way to a paintball complex in Fredericksburg, Virginia, hasn't been named. If you've been following federal weapons cases in the post-2025 period, and based on the channels you subscribe to, you probably have. This model is going to appear again. Comment why yes or no. Do you think the next operation like this will be caught the same way? By an intercept that wasn't meant to happen? The operation at Tactical Edge took 9 months to build and 40 minutes to execute. The machining shop in the rear building had been running for at least 18 months before federal agents walked through the door. 411 suppressors were recovered. The buyer network connected to at least 3 active federal cases in other jurisdictions remains under active investigation. The signal that started all of it was captured by a team looking for something else entirely. If the transformer on the county grid hadn't failed on May 28th, the surveillance coverage would have been uninterrupted. If the Pentagon team hadn't been operating near Virginia's coast, the intercept would never have been flagged. Subscribe to Bureau Night Shift. The next case in this series involves a distribution channel that makes the Tactical Edge network look regional. The facility is closed. The gray zone is open.